It is commonly known that many of our nation's early citizens had fled Europe and journeyed to the colonies to find religious freedom. But what role did the local church play in the founding of our nation? Did church pastors and ministers engage in the battlefield and the political arenas of their day? And how has American clergy historically responded to issues such as slavery and civil rights? Was the Christian church, as modern society now enforces, relegated to serving only religious matters within the four walls of the church? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series. During the Revolutionary War of the 1700s, the local church, pastors, and clergymen played a pivotal role in the founding of our nation. But how did the church respond to such lingering issues as slavery and civil rights? Is there still a role for churches and pastors to play in today's political arena? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Pastors were a substantial influence in America achieving its independence, but they were also just as substantial in helping America get its constitutional form of government.
Right.
So pastors were involved across the board in all aspects of culture, all aspects of society. They didn't have this carve-out like we do today that says, oh, you can't talk about that, you can't get involved in that. A citizen was eligible to be involved in every aspect of life and culture. Pastors were citizens, they could be involved. Now today, we've made them less than citizens. Well, since you're a pastor, you can't talk about that. You can't say that. Everyone else gets free speech, but you're a pastor, so you can't talk about that. You can't say that. So we've carved out and made pastors
180
less. It's
180 degrees again.
That's right. Because once we got out of the American Revolution, we were governing ourselves under the Articles of Confederation. That was okay as a starting place, but it was a terrible form of government, really weak, really inefficient. It couldn't fund itself. It had no enforcement mechanism. So preachers that were serving in the Continental Congress, folks like John Witherspoon, who's a signer of the Declaration, but he's a minister of the gospel, he was one of the first to start saying, we've got to get rid of this form of government. We've got to go to something much better. We need a constitutional form of government.
Right.
So the whole movement toward getting the Constitution, preachers were right in the forefront of leading that movement. And so as we moved into that period of the Constitutional Convention, actually creating and drafting the Constitution, preachers were still giving input on the things that needed to be in it because, again, just as in the American Revolution, they were some of the great intellectual sources in the founding era. Let's consider the impact of pastors on America's worldview 2 centuries ago. Today, we say that the Bible relates to every area of life, but back then we proved it in a manner that we rarely do today. We can see this simply by examining the sermon topics of earlier generations. And we have literally hundreds and even thousands of published sermons from early America. By the way, a published sermon like these represents only a small fraction of all the sermons preached in those days. Unlike today, where sermons are taped and put on file and reproduced on demand, 2 centuries ago it cost a considerable amount in both time and money to publish a sermon. So unless the demand for that sermon had been especially high from those who had heard it, it was not published. Therefore, a published sermon was a sermon that had had a significant life-changing impact on the listeners. The topics of these early sermons demonstrate that the church truly believed and taught the nation that there was nothing in all of life that the Bible did not address either directly or indirectly. For example, in 1755, when New England suffered an earthquake, the sermons following that event addressed earthquakes. In other words, the church said, we've just had an earthquake. What does the Bible teach us about earthquakes? And you can see from the title that this was a 5-part sermon series on what the Bible said about earthquakes. This sermon is from 5 years later. The topic is the Great Fire in Boston. In other words, there's just been a tragic event, What principles does the Bible provide to deal with this tragedy? By the way, these two sermons were preached by the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, one of the ministers specifically cited by John Adams as being behind our independence. And here's a sermon on a solar eclipse. I can safely say I've never heard a sermon on a solar eclipse. Yet it's amazing how many verses there are in this sermon that specifically address eclipses, the sun being darkened or the moon being darkened. You see, the church taught the nation of practical Christianity. No matter what occurs in any area of life, go to the Bible first, for it has the answers. And although this sermon is from 1851 and obviously not from the founding era, it still maintained a relevance to real life. Notice the topic, a sermon on a moral view of railroads. This minister pointed out that railroads were a part of transportation. And after he went through what the Bible taught about transportation, he then showed how railroads fit into God's overall transportation plan. Returning back to the founding era, this sermon is on the infirmities and comforts of old age. This doesn't seem to be a popular sermon topic today, yet we all know that aging has its challenges. And since aging has been going on since the beginning of mankind, don't we think that God might offer advice on the issues of aging? Indeed He does, and it's given here in this sermon. 2 centuries ago, we also had sermons on topics that might cause many to raise their eyebrows today. For example, this is called an execution sermon. It's a sermon preached on the execution of Henry Blackburn for the murder of George Wilkinson. You mean that when someone was put to death, we had a sermon on it? Yes, and often such sermons were based on the passage in Romans 13 where the Scriptures declare that God has given the sword to civil government. The sermon would investigate whether an execution was a proper use of the sword by civil government. This type of sermon was considered an occasional sermon, for it was a sermon that was preached because of a significant occasion. But there were also many types of sermons that were called annual sermons, sermons on specific topics preached annually. This annual sermon is called an artillery sermon. Once a year, the military assembled together and had a minister address the military to lay out from the Scriptures the proper role of the military. This clearly is a biblical subject addressed in both the Old and the New Testaments. Even John the Baptist had specific instructions for soldiers and officers as he was baptizing.
I can't help but just be impacted by the role reversal.
There was such influence there.
There was absolute influence held by the ministers of the gospel, and for the purpose of the spreading of the gospel, and for the purpose of creating our nation. And now a pastor, modern day, is even restricted from the pulpit to do what Congress asked the pastors to do by spreading the word about certain things that needed to be distributed through America.
Well, pastors are even being emasculated by the documents they themselves created that have now been turned on their head.
Wow.
I mean, if you go, you have the Declaration. Pastors are really a huge part of that. As a matter of fact, this rarely gets pointed out, but of the 56 signers of our national birth certificate, Declaration of Independence, 24 of the 56 held what are called Bible school or seminary degrees. So roughly half the signers of the Declaration have been trained for the ministry. Well, that's fairly substantial influence. Then you move to the Constitution. They had substantial influence there. Again, 44 of them were involved in the ratification process. States held ratification in the churches, etc. Now you move into the original form of government, the original constitutional form of government. First time the federal Congress meets. You got ministers right there again. As a matter of fact, the man chosen by his peers to be the first ever Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives was a minister of the gospel, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, first Speaker of the House. His brother was in Congress with him, and that was John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, who was also a preacher of the gospel. These two guys worked on forming the Bill of Rights. As a matter of fact, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, there's only 2 signatures at the bottom of the Bill of Rights. And one is Reverend Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. So our Bill of Rights, now we're being told, Bill of Rights, separation church and state, you preachers can't say anything. Wait a minute, time out. We don't even have the Bill of Rights if it wasn't for preachers like Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg being in a leadership position exerting what he did. So now the very things that faith and that people of faith and that ministers have created have now become a club to beat them back out of the very arenas that they gave freedoms to the rest of us in. It's unbelievable.
During the Revolutionary War of the 1700s, the local church, pastors, and clergymen played a pivotal role in the founding of our nation. But how did the church respond to such lingering issues as slavery and civil rights? Is there still a role for churches and pastors to play in today's political arena? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
When the Constitution was finished in Philadelphia, it then had to go to all the states to be ratified. So they head to the states for ratification. At the state ratification conventions, several of the states held the ratification for the U.S. Constitution in a church. That's where they held their convention. Massachusetts, North Carolina, the ratification conventions were in the church. Wow. You'll also find in the records that they opened with prayer. Prayer was a regular part of what they did. So in ratifying the Constitution, the church was again recognized as being significant. As a matter of fact, you'll find that the delegates to ratify the U.S. Constitution, 44 delegates to approve the U.S. Constitution, were ministers of the gospel. They were sent by their towns as their delegates, as their choice, as their selection to go ratify the Constitution. Here's another annual sermon. It's called an election sermon, and it's the longest traditional form of annual sermon in America. The first election sermon was preached in 1634 in Virginia, and for each year thereafter, right up until the 20th century, an annual election sermon is preached in pulpits across America. We understood that we had a dual citizenship. We indeed were citizens of heaven, but we also were citizens of earth. And God had placed us here in this country with a stewardship government that belonged to we the people. So what did God expect of us in our stewardship capacity over the civil government He had given us? What did He expect of us in the selection of our leaders? What did the Scriptures teach about this process? For almost 3 centuries, this was an annual sermon topic in America. I think you'll recognize the names in this sermon. It's a sermon preached before John Hancock, signer of the Declaration and the first governor of Massachusetts, and before Samuel Adams, also a signer of the Declaration and the first lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, and before the Council and Senate and House of Representatives of that state. Did you realize that in many states they began their legislative session by inviting a minister to preach a sermon addressing the biblical principles of lawmaking? Of course, the Bible offers much guidance on this topic, for not only is God the great lawgiver, but many heroes of our faith were also lawgivers, including Moses, Joseph, Daniel, and many others. These sermons, preached in legislative chambers, included a number of our founding fathers. For example, this sermon was preached before Samuel Huntington, the governor of Connecticut and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. This sermon was preached before Caleb Strong, the governor of Massachusetts, and one of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention who framed the Constitution. This sermon was preached before Oliver Wolcott, the lieutenant governor and then the governor of Connecticut, and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And there were many other sermons involving our founding fathers.
The very document, the Bill of Rights, drafted and signed by pastors, influenced by pastors, is being used to keep them out of the arena that document created to give us a freedom.
That's right. Separation of church and state, when that was given to us, it was given to us as an assurance. Jefferson gave it. It was an assurance that the government would not stop a public religious activity.
Correct.
Now we use separation of church and state to stop every public religious activity.
Right.
Bill of Rights was given to us to make sure we had free exercise of religion. Now the Bill of Rights is given to us to make sure you can't express your religion in a public place. We have free speech, but that doesn't include religious speech.
Wow.
I mean, all these rights that were really pioneered and championed by Christians, by ministers, are now being used against Christians to suppress them. We gave a constitution that's very inclusive, allows anyone to be elected under that, no religious test. Now we've imposed a religious test. Oh, you're a preacher, you can't run for public office. Wait a minute. The reason that clause is in there is because we had preachers involved in that.
Wow.
See, we see it even with judicial candidates. Oh, that's an evangelical Christian. We can't have that person in the court. We need to filibuster that person. And I've personally witnessed filibusters be conducted simply over the evangelical faith of nominees. One was a Sunday school teacher. We can't have that as a federal judge. One had a testimony on a website of what God had done in changing life. We can't have that person as a federal judge. So here, people of faith make sure that religion is not an issue, that anyone can run for office and be in office. And now, the very clause they created to do that has been flipped on its head to say, oh, you're religious, you can't be in office.
180 degrees different than the original intent.
How come? we buy into it.
No,
We've
how
been
come?
told.
Yeah.
That's it, because we the people believe that separation of church and state means you don't do religious stuff in public. We believe that a pastor shouldn't say anything political from a pulpit. Now wait a minute, time out. We've had pastors in America for 400 years. For 350 years, they could say anything they wanted to from a pulpit because we believed in free speech. Plus, we believed that a pastor did not account to the government for what he said. He counted to God and to his congregation for what he said.
Wow.
If that pastor said something that's wrong, his congregation will take him down and he'll answer to God. Now, if a pastor says something wrong, the IRS will take him down.
Yeah.
Now, since when did it become the responsibility of the government to monitor what's said in a pulpit, to care about what's said in a pulpit? It doesn't monitor what's said in free speech, it doesn't monitor what 527 groups, it doesn't monitor what political groups do, but we're going to monitor what pastors do. Unbelievable. And notice this sermon, a voice of warning to Christians on the ensuing election of a president of the United States. Did you know that American ministers used to stand in the pulpit and call candidates by name, call parties by name, set forth their positions, compare them to the Bible, and then advise that a Christian could or could not vote for a candidate based on what the candidate had said and what the Bible said? Today, this type of sermon might make many in churches uncomfortable, but it shouldn't. For not only was this a traditional practice of American pulpits, it's also a traditional practice set forth in the Scriptures. Consider how often God sent His ministers either to interface with or to confront civil leaders. For example, Elijah with Ahab and Jezebel, Samuel with Saul, Nathan and Gad with David, Isaiah with Manasseh, and so many other examples. There certainly is no model in the Bible where God has His ministers remain silent with civil leaders or about civil issues. The church speaking into the civil arena has been a long-standing practice in America, as had the practice of ministers serving directly in the legislature. In fact, it was Thomas Jefferson himself who encouraged the lifting of restrictions against ministers and clergy that had been imposed in his own state of Virginia. He declared,
I observe in the Virginia Constitution an abridgment of a right I do not approve. It is the incapacitation of a clergyman from being elected.
Thomas Jefferson wished to see clergymen possess the same rights as others. Today, however, this is not the case in the area of free speech, nor has it been since 1954, when a U.S. Senator became responsible for enacting a policy that treated nonprofit organizations, including churches, differently. He had been criticized for his political affiliations and his private business dealings, and not liking that criticism, he added a rider to an appropriation bill in the U.S. Senate, stipulating for the first time that a 501c3 organization, and churches are 501c3 organizations, that they must now stay out of the political arena. Most Christians think that the way it is today is the way it's always been. But this restriction is recent, as both American law books and early American sermons clearly demonstrate. The record is clear. The church helped shape the way that early America approached the issues of the day, and having taught the nation the relevancy of God's Word to every aspect of life, it's not surprising then that the Scriptures and writers on the Scriptures had such a profound impact on the founding of our government and its documents.
During the Revolutionary War of the 1700s, the local church, pastors, and clergymen played a pivotal role in the founding of our nation. But how did the church respond to such lingering issues as slavery and civil rights? Is there still a role for churches and pastors to play in today's political arena? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
Was there ever any event of emasculating pastors and Christian leaders in America?
Well, what happened, you had a freshman, or actually you had a young man running to be a freshman U.S. Senator. And in running from his home state, there was a foundation there that said, this guy is really bad. His moral life is bad, his character is bad, his business dealings are bad, his philosophy is bad. And so they pointed that out. Well, nothing new in American politics. That was pointed out with John Adams, and it was pointed out with Thomas Jefferson. Every president's ever run, every person's ever run for office had opponents that said things about them. Well, this particular man got elected as a freshman U.S. Senator. It was Lyndon Baines Johnson. He didn't like the fact that they had said some things about him. So in an appropriation bill that went through the U.S. Senate in 1954, he put a little one-line rider on the appropriation bill. It was a rider that was never debated in a Senate committee. It never went for any kind of a markup. It was just a floor amendment that got stuck on there. and said, oh, by the way, if you're 501c3, you can't talk about this stuff anymore. You just lost your freedom of speech. You talked about me, you've lost your freedom of speech. Now, every record indicates he had no intention of that applying to churches whatsoever. It was to go after his political opponents who had a foundation, and they went after him, so he's going after them. Well, it's one thing to do it from free speech, it's another to use the force of law to go after an opponent. You know, that's wrong on its face. Nonetheless, he did it. Within a number of years, the IRS started saying, well, you know, these foundations, churches are kind of like foundations, let's kind of put them under it. So without any law ever being passed, simply through regulatory administrative decisions, the IRS decides, you know, pastors and churches, they shouldn't be having free speech on these issues anymore. Now, they can speak about certain things, but not these issues. Well, you go, wait a minute, time out. These guys spoke about these issues from the very beginning. Likely we don't have our founding documents had they not been speaking about them. We've talked in previous programs that Declaration of Independence, there's nothing there that the pastors hadn't already addressed before 1763. Had they not been addressing it, it's likely not there. So now we're taking out the very voice that has such an impact on culture, had a positive impact on shaping culture. And now we're saying, we're going to listen to your free speech, and if it turns out to be religious, and if it turns out to be critical of something in the government, we're going to silence you. Well, if you go back into the scriptures, the biblical example had always been that God's ministers, the men of God, spoke into the political arena.
Yes.
If you recall, you have Elijah getting prepared to speak to Ahab and Jezebel. Now, Ahab and Jezebel have messed up a lot of stuff. They violated private property rights. They killed Naboth to get his vineyard. You can call that eminent domain. That's an abuse of eminent domain. So they do all this bad policy, and Elijah is just about to tell them, for 3.5 years, we've had really lousy policies from you, and God's going to judge you because of that. And just before Elijah said that, he fortunately remembered his 501c3 tax exemption and kept his mouth shut. No, that's not what happened. All throughout the scriptures, God's ministers spoke into every arena that needed a plumb bob of right and wrong. The ministers Nathan and Gad spoke to David and said, David, thou art the man. They're the ones that uncovered the adultery of Bathsheba, the murder of Uriah. But see, today, a minister couldn't do that. Under this last 40 years of IRS code, the minister can't do what he did for 350 years in America. He can't do what we've done for 5,000 years in the Bible. As a matter of fact, in USA Today, where we have this great free speech, which we love and cherish, it's a great thing. Jesus Christ could not walk into an American pulpit today and repeat what he said in the New Testament when he called Herod an old fox and he called the civil leaders a bunch of whitewashed sepulchres.
Wow.
If he did that today, Jesus Christ himself would be called up by the IRS. That was never the design of free speech. That was never the design to muzzle the role of pastors. But what's happened is we've allowed secular folks to tell Christians how to think and act and behave. What legacy will we leave the next generation? Many argue that the next generation is not our concern, for Christ will return before that. But it's important to recall that every generation since Christ was on earth has believed that Christ would return in their generation. So far, they've all been wrong. But nonetheless, we're told in 1 Thessalonians 5:2 to expect his return as a thief in the night. Yet regardless of what our eschatology might be, Jesus has clearly told us all in Luke 19:13 to occupy until he comes. Therefore, we should heed the warning delivered to citizens in 1803 when the Reverend Matthias Burnett charged,
Finally, ye whose high prerogative it is to invest with office and authority, or to withhold them, and in whose power it is to save or destroy your country, consider well the important trust which God has put into your hands. To God and posterity you are accountable for them. Let not your children have reason to curse you for giving up those rights and prostrating those institutions which your fathers delivered to you.
it's time for Christians to re-engage in civil stewardship from a biblical viewpoint, a viewpoint long understood by previous generations. It's time for Christians again to become salt and light in every arena of society, including the civil arena, and to influence society through acts as simple as voting. Indeed, the Bible reminds us that when the righteous rule, the people rejoice. But the righteous can't rule unless some of the qualified ones are willing to run for office, and unless the rest of us are willing to get out and elect them when they do run. Psalms 33:12 declares that blessed is that nation whose God is the Lord, and if America does not stay blessed, it will be because Christians did not stay involved. So let's get involved. Let's make a positive difference in America again. There's a great scripture in Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. In the King James it says, be not conformed to this world, be transformed. And the Phillips, I love this. Phillips translation says, don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold.
Yes.
And that's what's happened to churches and pastors and Christians, because now, if Congress were to suddenly repeal that IRS code, that provision that says that you can't speak about these, if suddenly churches had the right to do what they did for 360 years, if churches had the right to do what the Bible is filled with, examples of ministers speaking in those areas, suddenly if that became legal again, pastor's going to stand up in church and he's going to say something about political stuff. He's going to say, you know, there's a policy going through Congress right now that is a wrong policy. Here's what the Bible says about it. And there's candidates running trying to promote this wrong policy, and that's wrong. If he says that right now, let's say it was legal, who's going to jump him? 90% of the church. Preacher, you shouldn't be talking about that stuff in the pulpit. Why? Because we've been squeezed into the mold of the world. We've let secular folks tell the church what its role should be. That's nonsense. That's not constitutional. It's not historical. It's not biblical, but we've bought into it.
Yeah.
You know, if we didn't have clergy speaking out, we don't have America as we know it today.
Our pastor says it, don't be conned into a form.
Yeah, that's
You
it.
know, don't be conformed to this world.
Conned into a form.
Conned into a form.
Yeah.
And you know, I think that ultimately what we're discussing is the role of pastors that was so prominent prior to the Revolutionary War, after the Revolutionary War, going in the formation of the Constitution of the United States, and today pastors are but a shadow of the influence that was held by them in the founding years of our country.
They were the most important figure in a community. They were the chief educator. They set the tone for that community. They were the intellectual leader in that community. They were the courage and the backbone in that community. They would stand up against wrong, whether it was in civil government or in some other institution. And now we just kind of squeezed it into a little squeaky voice back in a corner somewhere, almost like a nuisance voice. It's such a different role for the church. It needs to get back to what biblically and historically and constitutionally that it's always been.
For more information on the American Heritage Series or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved, visit wallbuilders.com.